Thank you. And I have to say, it's really nice to be here with a group who's actually excited to begin the day with lots of charts and graphs about the North Carolina power system among friends. I'm also feeling a little pressure as the first speaker. I feel like if I blow by the 15-minute thing, it's all over. So I'm going to be really brief and kind of just issue spot. These are kind of dense slides. They tell a lot. But I'm glad somebody asked earlier, we are going to be making these available. So think of this as sort of a resource that we could go back to for this level setting that people were talking about. I also want everyone to know that I tried really, really hard in the name of state unity to pick a color blue that didn't reflect any particular school. So there should be some points for that.
It looks like Kentucky blue.
I went out of state. There's only so many shades I can go here. Okay, a couple of things to note here. Coal, that dark blue line, the one that started at the top. Going along in the 2000s, coal's about, at that point, like 2/3 of power generation in North Carolina. And then you see a pretty precipitous drop. From 2009 to 2015, 45% of that drops out. You see at the bottom, starting crawling along there in the green, is natural gas. Natural gas, as late as 2007, use of it to produce electricity in North Carolina was well behind the national average. At that point, about 3% of electricity in the state was powered by natural gas. The national average at that time was almost a quarter. In that time, North Carolina has made up time fast. We're about at the national average now. We're a little bit more than 30% electricity generation by natural gas. The country average is about 34. And you see it's about a mirror image of coal. As the coal was retired, it was replaced by natural gas in generation here. You have a couple of pretty constant players here. You've got nuclear in the purple going straight across, kind of just doing its thing for a while now. Same with hydro. Kind of pretty consistent players that, both non-emitting sources sort of playing a very consistent role over time here. Another change is that solar and wind barely making a dent until the last few years. So non-existent virtually past 2010. And now at this point, solar is really doing all the heavy lifting here. And it's about 3% of generation in North Carolina. There are a couple reasons for this. There are market drivers and there are policy drivers. On the market side, we've got lower natural gas prices, and I'd also say more consistent natural gas prices. We saw a lot of spikiness in natural gas prices throughout the 2000s. 2001, it was about $8. 2003, it was back up about $8. After hurricanes, we tend to see big spikes. After Katrina, it was over $13. After Ike, it was almost back up to $13. Since 2009, though, it has stayed in this sort of comfortable range of between maybe $3 and $5 per MMBTU. So not only is it lower, but it's also remaining pretty constant. And the fact that it's been remaining pretty constant, despite its history of volatility, has been making more and more utilities and independent power producers comfortable relying on this fuel source. Whether we'll continue to see that sort of leveling out of the prices, unclear, although a lot of people feel like the shale gas development has really changed the picture, that we have so much more supplies and so much more sort of economically feasible plays to exploit. Of course, it emits carbon, about half the amount of carbon dioxide out of the stack as coal, but since we're here talking about a clean energy plan, that's going to become relevant. Lower renewables prices as well. We also see customer demand for clean energy, and this has been something really interesting in North Carolina, even more than in other states. When you look at polls, this is not a partisan issue here anymore. Very, very high percentage of people are more supportive of political candidates, regardless of the party they affiliate with, if that candidate is for clean energy. And so it's really no longer this sort of partisan political wedge issue in North Carolina. And you see that in customer demand, both residential and also corporate. You also have a lot of big tech companies coming to the Southeast and coming to North Carolina with sustainability and clean energy goals and are demanding renewable energy to meet those goals. One example of the lower renewable prices, solar has dropped really remarkably in the last 10 years. This is a sunshot graph. Sunshot Initiative was something started by Secretary Chu in the Department of Energy. He really drew on his experience from Bell Labs and thought, you know what, we need to set really ambitious goals and then put together multidisciplinary teams to try to achieve those goals. Sunshot cannot take credit for all of this. There's also a very large country in East Asia that has played a huge role in bringing down costs of installed solar. But there's been a lot of research and development and a lot of advancements made in the improvement of the performance and the cost effectiveness of solar. And so you see what seemed to be a really ambitious goal, which was to drop installed solar costs 75% from 2010 to 2020, has already been achieved in the utility scale solar. And we're getting close in commercial and residential. There's also been policy drivers for that really rapid generation mix change that we've seen in the last 10 years in North Carolina. Jonas is going to talk a lot about the renewable policies, both federal and really focused on the state policies that have driven a lot of that uptick of solar in particular. There is some concern now with the 30% solar tariffs that we've put on solar imports, whether that might have a chilling effect on the sort of demand and interest in building utility scale solar. But for right now, this is looking like a good future for that particular that particular type of power generation, at least from the cost side of things. We've also had environmental laws, and there was a really interesting complementarity that happened in North Carolina between the Clean Smokestacks Act, which was enacted in 2002, and ongoing Clean Air Act litigation against a lot of the largest coal-fired power plants in the state. Clean Smokestacks Act set really aggressive standards for NOx and SOx for the power fleet in North Carolina. It also had a really interesting sentence in it that said, if you end up having to if you're a utility and you have to put on pollution control equipment as the result of a federal court order, you can't pass those costs off to your ratepayers. So you saw as the Clean Air Act case sort of warmed up, heated up, in fact, post-2007, when Duke Energy lost a pretty significant issue in that case at the Supreme Court, that is one of the drivers for the beginning of a pretty aggressive retirement or control schedule that you saw from 2009 to 2015, with that very important backstop that the North Carolina legislature had put in place. You also see in 2009, the Clean Smokestacks Act is amended, and in it is a provision that if there is a coal site in North Carolina, and if the utility goes to the commission or goes to the agency and asks for permits to retire the coal plant and build a gas plant, that permitting gets expedited and is done in 45 days. Remember the graph I showed of as soon as coal was dropping, you had that mirror image of natural gas increasing. So there's a policy driver there. As a result, you've got some pretty significant power sector emissions trends. So we're emitting less than 10% of the sulfur dioxide from the power sector in North Carolina than we were 10 years ago. Demand trends. We are generally seeing a flattening of electricity demand in this state. And this is tracking national averages as well. I split it out into the three sectors because one of the reasons is that our economy is shifting to a less energy-intensive economy. So you do see a drop in industrial that happens about 10 years ago. But that does not fully explain this. So we also can look to energy efficiency policies that are sort of flattening out that demand curve. And so this is an energy efficiency chart. Jonas is going to get into the different types of service providers in the state, but generally investor-owned utilities serve about 2/3 of the customers and deliver about 3/4 of the load. Another thing to note in this chart, if you go back to look at it, these are only incremental increases of energy efficiency each year. So if I, say, switch out a light bulb this year, that more energy-intensive light bulb is going to give me energy savings for more than just this year. That would be the cumulative effect if you keep adding that up over time. This is just what is added to the mix each year. Electricity rates and bills. So North Carolina, right now it's about $10.94 per kilowatt hour. That's pretty cheap in the United States. We've got below us the sort of Pacific Northwest with very, very, very cheap federal hydro, which we're never going to beat. The rates have hovered about 11 cents in the last 10 years, but we've become relatively lower in rates than other parts of the country. So 10 years ago, we were like number 33, and now we're 41. So other states, their rates have increased. Our consumption is higher than average, and that's in part because we're the 11th or 12th hottest state, too, in the summer, so we've got that load. Also, relative energy efficiency policies. Average monthly bill, $114. One thing to note here when we think about rates, equity. There's a lot of poverty in this state. We have about 15% of people living in poverty. That means a household of 4 making about $25,100 a year. That's the poverty line. So this monthly bill is about 5% of that family's income going to pay for the electricity bills. You also think about renters. The majority of renters in North Carolina live in poverty. They tend to be in substandard housing, which may lead to much higher bills because they're not weatherized. So where are we headed? These are the projections based on IRPs. And you see continued, there's some leveling out in the near term of coal, but then a continued downturn of coal. You've got nuclear staying about the same. You've got hydro staying about the same. You have both kinds of gas, combined cycle and combustion turbines, on a pretty sharp increase. And then leveling out in the mid-2030s. That tells you the same thing. Couple reasons why. Coal fleet. What we've seen so far are the older, smaller units retiring. And right now, we've got some bigger ones that are a little younger that are in the mix that are going to sort of maintain through the 2020s. But then, as we all know, time marches on and we all get older. And as those plants get older, and if there is that increasing pressure from lower renewables costs and lower natural gas costs and or carbon regime, you see more of these forced out. Nuclear fleet, all 5 of our nuclear units have been relicensed for the next 20 years. They're all fairly young, and so they're pretty new in that next extension. There will be a question less than 20 years out, they'll begin their permitting process to extend their licenses to what would be 80 years. We only have 1 unit at this point in the United States that is seeking that 80-year extension, and all eyes are on that to see if the NRC will license a reactor that far into the future. Jonas is going to talk about renewables, but we're seeing that wind is just not sort of getting a foothold here quite yet for economic reasons, at least according to the investor-owned utilities. We've got some strong drivers, policy drivers from North Carolina. Storage not really making a dent yet, which is really interesting given all of the solar we have. And one thing I did just want to point out, going back here, these are capacity projections, so just to make the difference between generation and capacity. So the slides of where we are today, looking at all the various types of power, that was what is actually producing power. This is what is installed. When you've got nuclear runs at north of 90%. So if it's there, it's on and it's running and it's producing electricity. Solar, much smaller utilization factor, both for, practical reasons, the sun's not shining, and also based on the comfort of the dispatcher. So here you see solar is way high up there, but this is capacity and not generation. And I think just end here, and I've got both Duke Nicolas Institute, where I work, but also Duke Energy Initiative. Brian Murray is here, and we've been working a lot of these issues together. Sarah Adair, I think, also may have helped with this slide long ago, but these are some we've replaced the things that we're thinking about. So just things to think about in these plans of sort of, what are we thinking about distributed generation? What are we thinking about solar? What are we thinking about the internet and digitalization and maybe the use of demand response as a tool in our generation mix? And then performance-based rate making, because we saw that flat demand. We saw a potential, uptick in lots of new capital costs. We've got new transmission upgrades to do, and that's being spread over fewer kilowatt hours. The way our rates are set up now, there may be a disincentive to do some of the things that we want to do. So thinking about how to change the incentive structure. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jonas.
I didn't choose a neutral color, but it's not coming through very well here.
So I want to begin here first by thanking Sushma for inviting me to come and be a part of this. I also want to thank the governor's staff and the DEQ staff for doing all the work that it's taken to get this conversation going. I think it's incredibly important for North Carolina, and this is a good time to be doing it. Last caveat here at the beginning, since I will be talking about Duke Energy and rate setting, I want to be transparent. The center that I run at UNC Law School, the primary funder is the Duke Energy Foundation. So I want to make sure that's on the table. Okay, so I've been asked to give a kind of a basic overview of the retail providers, so the participants in the electricity sector that are delivering power that Kate went through with the generation mix, and also the rate setting process. Looking at the faces around this room, I'm not sure that anybody in this room needs that basic overview, but I'm going to do it. If it's too basic, we can go into more details in the question and answer. Okay, so this is a map. I got this from Carolina Country, which is the magazine that the Electric Membership Corporation puts out. It's a map of all of the service territories in North Carolina. So one thing to note, there's a lot up here, okay? We have 5 major categories of electricity retail providers in North Carolina. We have Duke Energy Progress, which is the vertical stripe line here, kind of triangle west, right? That's when Progress and Duke Energy were separate utilities. That was the Progress utility. It's still operated as a separate grid. From the kind of triangle west, Duke Energy Carolinas. In almost every state in North Carolina, sorry, almost every county here in North Carolina, we have electric membership co-ops. The black dots here are municipal utilities, and then in the northeastern part of the state, we have another investor-owned utility, Dominion. Okay. This is just breaking it down. So Duke Energy Progress, 1.5 million customers, 12.8 gigawatts of summer generation capacity. Duke Energy Carolinas, 2.5 million customers. Some of those are in South Carolina. So in North Carolina, we have 1.8 million customers, 19.6 gigawatts. The electric cooperatives, 1 million customers. And here I do want to point out, so even though we're talking about Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, and then the other entities, the electric co-ops get about 40% of their power from Duke Energy. Okay, so when we're looking at customers, there's one way to cut this generation, right? Duke Energy plays a larger role than these numbers would point out here in North Carolina. Dominion, about 120,000 customers. And then the munis, somebody in the room might know actually how much power the munis get from Duke Energy. I don't have that number. It's most of it. But 70 communities, about 500,000 customers. You might know the percentage-wise? 100%. Okay, not just most of it, all of it. Great, thanks. Okay, so this is a imperfect chart. I use this when I teach energy law. There could be a lot more boxes and certainly a lot more arrows on here, but I think it makes the general point. When we're thinking about regulation of the electricity sector, it's not just utility commission oversight. It's not just rate setting. There's a lot that influences if a utility is going to build something, and if they answer that yes to that question, what is the utility going to build? Okay, so I'll just start here. So mandates, we have a renewable portfolio standard here in North Carolina. Existing infrastructure, pipelines, transmission lines, fuel price projections, electricity demand going forward, available financing, so incentives, loan guarantees, tax credits, et cetera. Available technologies, right? What's the suite of options available for generating electricity? Federal and state environmental laws. And then back over here, state utility regulations, so rate setting. Each one of these factors has laws, policies, regulations that influence whether an electricity provider is going to build something, and again, if so, what? And I think for this conversation, as the workshop discussion progresses, I think it's important to keep this broader suite of policy drivers in mind. Okay. Traditional rate setting, traditional regulation. So the state and the investor-owned utilities have made an agreement with one another. The utilities get an exclusive service territory. So for the map that I showed earlier, right, the retail provider of electricity, with very few exceptions, the retail provider of electricity on those maps, that's the only entity that can sell power to an end user. In exchange for that exclusive service territory, the investor-owned utility agrees to provide reliable and safe power, can't discriminate. So if you're in that service territory and you want power, the utility has to get it to you. And the state PUCs set electricity rates and the return on investments, which I'll say a bit more about in just a moment. I won't, for the sake of time, won't read all of these roles here that the PUC plays, since the slides will be available. Flip here to the next slide, and then we'll talk about rate setting. So here we have the North Carolina Utilities Commission in the state, 7 commissioners. We also have a public staff, which is under the NCUC, but operates as a kind of a separate agency, the consumer advocate there. The PUC hears rate cases, and investor-owned utilities submit annual integrated resource plans to the Utilities Commission, and that's available to the public once submitted. Okay, price regulation. How does the Utility Commission set rates? Again, this is the 101 version of this conversation. We have a revenue requirement. So the Utility Commission is setting rates based on the cost of providing power, right? So not based on market competition here, but based on an assessment of what it takes to provide power to the system. O in this formula is operating expenses. So these are variable expenses like fuel prices. So Kate mentioned that natural gas prices go up and natural gas prices go down. The investor-owned utility doesn't have to go to the Utilities Commission and get permission to purchase power at different prices at any moment where that price fluctuation is taking place. So there's operating expenses that's passed on to the customers. The utility doesn't make money based on the operating expenses. These are expenses the utility just has to cover in order to keep the system running. Okay, so B in this formula, this is rate base. These are the fixed costs. These are the capital costs. This is the steel. This is the concrete, right, that goes into the ground. Sorry, this is also something I've used for class, so that's the book refers to this. Just ignore that part. So this, what's that?
Are you assigning us homework?
Yeah.
We will be later.
So the rate base, this is when the utility has to build a power plant, when the utility is building transmission lines. This is going into the fixed cost part of the formula. And then I mentioned that the utility doesn't make money on the operating expenses, but the little r here, this is the rate of return, right? So this is the amount of money that Duke Energy or Dominion, right, can make based on its investments. This goes back to shareholders, and there's a reason for this, right? So these are investor-owned utilities. These are private companies. They have shareholders, but we're also part of the deal that we have with the investor-owned utility is that the investor-owned utility is going to the marketplace to attract capital so it can make the investments that we expect it to make so that it can provide the affordable and reliable power. So the rate of return, anytime there's a rate case, if the rate of return is increased or decreased, that gets a lot of attention. I don't want to offer an opinion about what the rate of return here in the state should be, but just know that the reason there's that rate of return and the reason that it's set where it's set is that's the Utility Commission's assessment of the amount of return that the private company needs to make in order to attract capital in the marketplace. Okay, I'm going to close out here. I was asked to talk a bit about policies impacting clean energy investments. If we went back to the figure that I showed you earlier, this could be a very long list. What I'm highlighting here are a couple of what I think are kind of ongoing questions for the future about what kind of policies are going to impact clean energy investments. One is PURPO, and this is for those of you that follow the Utility Commission proceedings. This is where the avoided cost comes in. So with PURPO, if you meet the definition of what's called a qualifying facility, so under 80 megawatts, and generally if you're a renewable energy provider, then you can sell to the utility, or the local provider of electricity has to buy your power. And they buy it at the avoided cost. There are different ways of deciding what that avoided cost is. Here in North Carolina, the Utility Commission sets the avoided cost rate. And of course, I don't have to tell everybody here that what you get paid for your power is going to influence whether you build something and whether you want to sell power. So this is an ongoing question, I think. HB 589. So this is the 2017 statute that has implemented the competitive bidding process for utility scale solar. Also has a number of other provisions in it. Community solar, limited third-party leasing, the green tariff program, which Brad may say something about later when he gets up to talk. So a number of provisions here. Again, 2017 statute. The first auction just took place. So this is we're going to have 3 more years of the competitive bidding process for solar. We'll see how it works out. Environmental regulations. Kate talked briefly about this. I think of the Clean Air Act as much as an energy law as I do as an environmental law. And when I was working with Tim and Brian and others at the Nicolas Institute, when we started engaging with utility commissioners across the Southeast, it was around the mercury rule at the same time that natural gas prices were falling through the floor. So if you have to reduce mercury at a coal-fired power plant, and you may have a future where natural gas prices are going to remain very cheap, how do you deal with that? Do you shut down the coal-fired power plant, replace it with natural gas, or not? And by the way, there's at the time uncertainty about what the EPA was going to do about greenhouse gas emissions. Right, this was before the Clean Power Plan. So I think environmental regulations, when we're looking forward, your assessment of what the rules may be, again, coming from the federal government or coming from the state government, about environmental regulation has a direct influence on what you want to build and how you operate your system. And then this last point, market competition, partly is related to HB 589, where there's, again, the competitive bidding process for utility scale solar. Duke Energy can compete for 30% of that, but if they can win the bids, other companies are competing directly with Duke Energy. When we think about the monopoly utilities versus restructured states, so some states have moved away from the monopoly structure for electric utilities. We often talk about it, or hear people talk about it in terms of like there are 2 poles, right? Either you have a monopoly or you have competition. And the fact of the matter is there's a spectrum. Right, so Duke Energy has to take into consideration market fluctuations in fuel prices, for example, with smart thermostats. Right, so now Nest, owned by Google, can help us manage our electricity consumption when we are heating and cooling our homes, for example, which has an impact on electricity demand, not just overall electricity demand, but at what points during the day are we using electricity? Are we shifting our consumption more to when the sun is shining, or are we using it at night? So our utilities are not insulated from market competition. And I think HB 589 points out that there are opportunities, and states are exploring opportunities, including here in our state, about how can you increase opportunities for third parties to play a role in the electricity sector without also undermining the monopoly. All right, I think that where that conversation goes here in North Carolina, I think it's going to have a lot to do with whether stakeholders view HB 589 as a success or not. So with that, I think I'll stop, and we've got a few minutes for questions.
Bravo on timing, you guys. Wow, that is impressive. Great. So as I said, we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. I have Lauren over here with the mic and Leah as well. A reminder that we do have the Post-its also on your table with Sharpies. If you have a question that you may not want to vocalize right now or it comes to you later, we'll have these flip charts up around the room throughout the rest of the day. So, and once again, these are clarifying questions. We don't want to get too off track at this point, but does anyone have a question? Start us off. Sir in the back.
Sure. Steve Calland with Clean Tech Center. Jonas, this is something I've always actually wondered about. You talked about the regulatory compact and the role of with the IOUs. They get their guaranteed monopoly. In turn, they have to provide safe, reliable energy and at a regulated rate. The munis and co-ops are not fully regulated. In fact, I think the munis in this state are not regulated at all through the commission, but are still subject to the safe and reliable part of the regulatory compact. Can you clarify kind of where the co-ops sit in that discussion, and maybe a little bit about how the munis and co-ops wound up kind of in a different situation?
Yeah, so thank you. So the co-ops operate more like the munis than they operate like the utility commission. So they're making, well, first off, they get most of their power from the North Carolina Electric Membership Corporation. So the individual co-ops are getting power from basically a statewide trade group. They used to have to submit IRPs to the Utilities Commission. Now they don't, and it's the Utilities Commission doesn't oversee the rates charged by the individual co-ops.
Okay, other question? Right here?
Actually, can I just one more point? I mean, I think part of it, if you think about the way that they're structured, Duke Energy or Dominion as investor-owned utilities, private companies, right? They have an incentive to maximize profits. The electric membership co-ops are member-owned, and right.
I guess it's a question about infrastructure, both storage and transmission. You know, a two-part question: what would drive investment more in advances in high-tech transmission and grid and storage infrastructure, and what's the regulatory environment for those investments?
All right, I think we might both take a stab at this, but that's a very good question. I think part of it is a matter of looking to other states and seeing other states that have had success with more either storage on its own or storage in combination with intermittent generation. With some, it's been basically like an RPS and just setting a standard and saying we want this much built in the state. In some of the power markets, there's been a sort of growing interest in matching storage to renewables, because then you firm up that, particularly for the capacity markets, and then you end up being eligible to bid into those 1 year out, 3 year out auctions for energy that you can guarantee will be available in those future times. That second is not going to be as applicable here under the current structure, but there are certainly I think some of the policy tools that the North Carolina legislature and the PUC have taken that have led to advances in solar could similarly drive some investment in storage. I do think, though, also, as I was saying at the end of the presentation, I do think while we're thinking about during this clean energy plan about all the things that folks would like to see built, understanding that with flat demand and fewer or stagnant kilowatt hours being sold, we may also need to talk about how a utility is incentivized. That rate structure that Jonas pointed out, it really is driven by the number of kilowatt hours sold once you get away from the capital investment. And so figuring out, are there different ways to structure that so that a utility is made whole and incentivized to do things like deploy energy efficiency, deploy demand response, build storage. So those are some of my quick thoughts.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing that I would add, I should have mentioned this during my presentation, is When the utility commission is evaluating whether or not something should be added to rate base, right? So the capital investment, or the utility commission generally uses what's called the least cost mandate, right? So because that formula incentivizes making capital investments, right? The utility commission wants to make sure that the utility is making the investments that are necessary to do what we expect the utility to do, but not making investments that are more expensive than they need to be, because they get the rate of return on that, right? So what I would add to what Kate said is, if the utility commission views, or if Duke Energy views energy storage as a least cost option for providing power and meeting the other public goals that we have and we expect out of the electricity sector, that's another way to open the door for storage. So, I mentioned environmental regulations and looking ahead about if you think it's going to be more expensive to emit pollutants in the future than it is today, one of the ways to hedge against that risk is to have generation that's not emitting pollutants. And renewables, if you add that with storage, is a way to generate electricity without emitting pollutants. So if that's looking ahead, if that's viewed in like a least cost framework in the same way that a natural gas generation is viewed, then that's another way for it to be an opening without needing the additional policy incentives that Kate mentioned.
One really quick on top of that is just thinking, and it's for discussion here, but sort of thinking about the difference between what we saw of generation by solar and capacity by solar. We have a lot of capacity in this state that is going unused because it doesn't have storage or something else to back it up.
Great, thank you.
Over here.
Okay, why don't we take one over here and then.
Hi, Ryan Miller with North Carolina Building Performance Association. So question for you, Kate. With energy efficiency being the largest sector of the clean energy economy, with companies, jobs, revenue, all those items, and maybe a 17% or so opportunity to save energy in North Carolina with buildings and various types. How do we get energy efficiency to be on the same kind of platform as other generation resources, where it's a negative resource that's the least costly, easiest to save energy in the first place? How do we do that?
So first, I'm going to plug the North Carolina Energy Efficiency Roadmap that many of you are part of, and that's being led by Jen Weiss here, my colleague at the Duke Nicolas Institute, where we are thinking about exactly those drivers, and you know that. You're a strong participant in that. I didn't mean I'm sort of becoming the performance-based rate-making person here, but we're sort of hitting a theme here. I do think that one suite of policies or rate-making decisions that could be considered when you look at other states is, if you get out of compensation for amount of power you're selling, you can then start to have that conversation of seeing energy efficiency and demand-side management as a supply-side resource, because it's not money being taken from the investor-owned utility or sort of foregone profits. You can have a conversation about what's the best service to be delivering at this moment, and it may be that it's a lot cheaper to peak shave here through demand response than to be adding on a peaker unit. It's a lot easier to have those conversations when and I'm going to use the word, I'm not using it in the leak because I know decoupling has people have tremors from that in this state, but just using, take away there's no other better verb to describe that. If you can, I'll say separate compensation from kilowatt hours sold. I think you can really open up the type of conversation you're raising there.
Great, I think we have time for one more question. Was there? Okay.
Yeah, a question about natural gas prices going forward. Two of them, actually. One is a lot of discussion I've heard about whether fracked gas wells will continue to produce at the rate that people are saying or not. And the other is that I heard a presentation recently that at the end of this year, 2019, the amount of LNG exported will be equal to 40% of the gas that's currently being used for generation, and the effect of that on pricing.
I think we should ask Brian, do you have any insights on that? So am not able to answer the question directly. It's just it's outside of my area of expertise. At least as of a couple of years ago, what I'd learned from a former colleague at Duke University is we just don't know about the long-term producing of the fracked wells because it's so new that we've been relying on fracked wells. You can go back in and refracture them, right, and continue to get gas, but I don't know how long they're projected to last. Again, I'm looking at you, Brian, because I may not still be doing great the longer I talk.
Long-term projections for natural gas are pretty modest increases, but it's nothing really escalated. Those are from agencies that are often criticized for their long-term projections. I think if you go out and try to buy things in the gas market, that's probably a good indication of where we think markets are going, at least in the near term.
I mean, I do think there have been some studies suggesting that the production curves are steeper, at least in the early years, that you sort of get a lot out of a fracked well the first year, and then the decline is much more rapid. But as Jonas said, we don't actually know what sort of happens over 20 years because we have very few wells that have been horizontally drilled and fractured through shale that have reached that age yet. I do think that there, to Brian's point, I think there's just growth. There's growth in the number of wells. There's growth in the plays that are being discovered that are economically feasible to recover. But there's also growth in demand, both here and overseas. And so where that falls out on any given day of sort of supply versus demand and where the prices would go. I mean, people are talking as if this is a game changer starting 10 years ago. But if you look at the previous many decades of natural gas, it does tend to be volatile. So yeah, I guess I'd agree with Brian that when you go to buy gas and that's the price, that's how you know what the price is going to be.